So we'll be moving on to sew our peplum top now, and this is the front yoke, this is the back yoke, this is the shoulder, and this is the shoulder here. So let me just open this up so that you see properly. The first thing I'll be doing here is to join the shoulder of the back yoke to the front on both sides. So I'm going to be sewing 1/2 inch here and 1/2 inch this way. And okay, let's just see this. I'm sewing here by 1/2 inch, and I'll do same this way, 1/2 inch. Once we are done, I'm going to make use of a bias. This is a bias strip, and you have a 1 inch fold here. It's a 1 inch fold, quarter inch on both sides, and 1 inch. So it's usually folded into two this way, 1/2 inch and quarter inch on both sides and 1/2 inch at the middle. So this is how it comes. So we're going to be using this to turn the neckline of our yoke from the back all the way to the front. So let's go to sewing. So now I've placed the right side of each, the front and back of my cape facing each other. That's the right side of the back facing the right side of the front, so that I can sew from the wrong side by 1/2 inch. So that I'm doing same on both sides of the shoulder. So I'm done joining the front and back shoulder together, and the next thing I'll be doing is to use bias strip to turn my neckline. I'll also be doing the same thing to the armhole. This is the back armhole, and we'll continue till we get to the front armhole. Remember when we're sewing, we added 1/2 inch, right? So I'll be placing 1/4 inch against 1/2 inch here, so that I won't have any excess, because ideally this part is actually 1/4 inch. So if I just place them together, I will be sewing 1/4 inch instead of 1/2 inch that I took out when I was cutting for my allowance on the neckline. So I'm going to place this 1/4 inch part of my strip against 1/2 inch of the fabric. That's just to ensure I have accuracy in my measurement and all that I took out on my fabric. So when I'm done, I'm going to trim out that extra 1/4 inch that is not needed here. So here I'll open up the seam. You can trim it, but because I'm working with cord lace, it does not fray. As the edges don't misbehave, in other words. So I may not have to weave it, and yet we'll have neat edges. So I opened up the seam along the shoulder. I opened up the sewing allowance inside. That's what I did on this edge. So anytime you're sewing across a seam, you should open the seam up, the seam allowance. So here I'm done sewing. I'll just take my scissors and trace out this 1/4 inch I have outside here. So I'll do that on all the sides of my neckline. So I'm trimming out the excess. Let's assume I'm making use of piping or something. I'll have just sewn 1/2 inch of my strip. Let's assume I made the strip by myself and all that, but this strip comes in 1/4 inch, and I still wanted to take 1/2 inch off my fabric. So I have a 1/4 inch extra. That's what I'm trimming out. So because this is a neckline, you should notch. But because the back strip is stretchy and this lace is also stretchy a little bit, I don't really need to notch. They are both stretchy, so I'll just fold it in and sew my second seam for the neckline. Okay, so the next thing I want to do now is to fold my bias strip the second time. So I'm going to take the usual fold, that's the second fold, this fold you're seeing. I'm going to fold it in this way and then turn it again. And right now I'm just going to sew. You can sew from here, from the other side, by 1/8 inch or even less on this edge all through. So I'm going to take this seam to the other end of my neckline. So our neckline is turned in this way. So we're going to do the same thing along the armhole here on both sides. So I'm still working on the armhole here from the front all the way to the back. Okay, now so I will just set this apart and we'll fix our bustier. Once you are done with the bustier, we can then join this to the bustier. So now this is the side panel of our front. This is the center panel of the front. And I've gone ahead to iron a soft interfacing. You also watch the part where we fix the bustier, the wording. So right now I'm going to place the right side of the side panel against the center panel, and I'm going to sew by 1/2 inch. I'll start from the base, that's from the waistline, sew by 1/2 inch all the way till I get to the top. So I'm going to do the same thing on the other side as well, and on my lining. So I have lining exactly this shape. I have another lining, two of this shape. So I'm just going to connect them the way I would do to my fabric. So I'm starting from the waistline. Make sure your pieces are well placed together, and you start sewing by 1/2 inch from the base. So we have this, and I'll just go ahead and sew the other parts the way I did this exactly. Place the right side of the side panel against the right side of the centerpiece panel, and you sew from the lower part, the waistline, by 1/2 inch. Okay, so now we have a cup looking pretty. This is actually the part where you check to be sure that you have the same cup on both sides. Yes, I know you have done all the measurements and you cup the curves the right way. So if you have done that properly, you should not have any issue here. But just take a look at it and be sure they are both the same on both sides, and you have properly sewn the two sides equally, because that may cause a variation in the shape of the cup outside if you haven't done so well. So the next thing you should do now is to notch on your cup. Remember I said anytime you sew a curvy edge, you should notch. So your cup is included in that. So it's curvy and you should notch all the curvy parts. The underbust line is very important here. So you do that on the both curves. So the next thing I'll be doing now is to sew my lining together. So I'm going to take the side panel of the lining and I'll sew it onto the center panel on both sides. Just what we have done for the main bodies. So here our lining is sewn in, and what we want to do now is to attach this neckline, the yoke, to our bodies for the front. So I'm going to notch the center of my lower bodies. Sorry, not my lower bodies, of the this part. So I'm going to notch the midpoint, tiny notch, and I'll do the same thing to my yoke. So I'm marking the midpoint here. So now I'm going to place I'm going to face the right side of my yoke with the right side of my bodice and hold this midpoint I marked. I'm going to hold the midpoint together. Okay, here, and I'll pin all the way to the side. I'm going to need like quarter of an inch, half of an inch here. Remember there's half an inch allowance on the armhole here, so don't pin to the extreme edge of your armhole. So now I'm going to sew here by half an inch so that we'll have this at the end of the day. Okay. So as you're sewing, remove your pins and continue sewing your half inch. So if you have created a curve like mine, be sure that you are following all the details of that curve If you have created a sweetheart neckline, make sure you are following the shape while sewing. So I have this at the front. I have this at the front. And the next thing I'll do is to remember my lining. I've joined my lining together here. So I'm just going to use this. I'll place the right side. I'll make sure the right side of my lining is facing the right side of my fabric. So we're going to sandwich the yoke between the lining and the main fabric. Right side of the lining facing the right side of the yoke, of the main fabric, with the yoke in between, so that we can turn this seam inward and we'll have a neat finishing inside. And now I'll be sewing my lining in, and I'll be sewing exactly where I sew when I was attaching my cape. So if you sew a lesser allowance, just know that you're going to be having some funny look on the outside. Before you start sewing, make sure you notch all around, if you're making this shape. And if you're not, either way, even if you're making a sweetheart neckline, you should notch all around. And you must make sure that the dart of your lining aligns with this part of your main piece. That's the joining here at the bustier. If it doesn't, you pleat it a little bit. It won't be obvious, to cover up for the excess you have of the lining, hopefully, because you can't pleat the clothes. You can only pleat the lining a little bit if it's in excess. But then you should also try to avoid that by cutting accurately. So this is what we have done. We have a neatly finished inner part. So right now, we'll work on the back. We're going to take in our dart at the back, and we'll do the same thing for the lining. Remember, our dart was at, I think, 4.5 inches. So I'm just going to mark that. Ideally, you should notch the position of your dart, or you create that sharpness so that you know where exactly your dart is. But now I'll be taking my dart all over again. If I had done the notching, I won't need to waste time doing this any longer. So from the zip allowance, remember we cut out ½ inch from this part of the zip after taking our darts, right? So that should be at 4 inches normally. Then we added the 1 inch zip allowance even with this excess, so I'm going to mark 5. I'll just do the notching here. So now I'm going to take my 1 inch dart, that's ½ inch on both sides. Make sure this part is straight, else you won't have a straight dart. So I'm making a 5 inches long dart for this part. So make sure the edge of your dart is sharp, not curvy. I'll do the same thing on the other side. I'm marking my 5 inches. Taking a 1 inch that's ½ inch on both sides. This is what the back should look like once you're done fixing the dart. So I'm going to go ahead and fix the darts. So in my darts on my lining, and we'll move on to the next thing. You remember how we joined the front piece to the front yoke? So we're going to do that for the back as well. So we're going to join this to the back for each side. You have to be mindful of the side you're placing on your yoke. So this side belongs to this because this is our armhole here, and our armhole is continuous this way, and this is the wrong side of the fabric for the boat. So I'm going to sew here in by ½ inch. Remember, our yoke didn't extend to a zip allowance, so leave that 1 inch zip allowance at the zip part of your back. Then another ½ inch at the edge here, the sewing allowance for our armhole this way. We are going to be sewing it by ½ inch. Once I'm done, I'm going to pick the lining for this side, and so this is the lining for this side. I'm going to make sure that the right side is facing the right side of my fabric. Then I'll sew by this same ½ inch again up to the zip allowance this time to close up the upper part of my dress, or my top rather. So I'll go through the same process for the other side of my back piece. So this is what we have at the front, and we have a neatly finished back this way. But before I go back before I start working on the other part of my back, let me show you what happens here. So before closing every other thing up, I'm going to make a top stitch here, just so this part rests properly. So I'm going to make a 1/8 of an inch top stitch while placing the sewing allowance inward, that's towards the lining, all the sewing allowance towards the lining. I'm going to top stitch on the lining by 1/8 of an inch. So I'll do the same thing for the front lining and the other side of my back. So once that is done, I will need to close up my zip allowance. Let's close up this zip allowance by 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch, just to have a neat edge here. So this is our zip allowance, and I'm also going to close up the armhole. Since our peplum top is sleeveless, of course that's why we had to finish the armhole of the yoke this way. So I'm taking in the 1/2 inch allowance I left at the armhole. So this is what we have here. So at this stage, you should go ahead and give this a good press. So I'm going to do this to the other side. So this is what we have from inside, and this is what it looks like from outside. Now we have our back and front attached to each other. We've turned the seam with our lining, so we have our lining covering here, we have our zip allowance sewn in here, and the next thing we'll be doing now is to work on the armholes. So we have 4 armholes, right? 2 at the front and 2 at the back. So from here, we are going to take in our armhole. We'll use the lining to turn the main fabric. So this is what you do. Remember, we have 1/2 an inch here. So you're just going to turn your lining around this way. So it's like covering up this rough edge. And we'll go ahead to sew by 1/2 an inch on this side. We'll come to the back and do the same. Turn the lining, exposing this raw edge. So we'll sew here in, and at the end of the day, we'll have a neat edge showing outside. So let's do that. So you have this at the armhole. So I'll do the same to all the armholes, the 4 armholes we have. So I have my armhole closed up. So you should go ahead and give this a good press. You press as you sew. So the next thing I'll be doing here is to hold my zip allowance. Remember, my zip allowance is no longer up to 1 inch because I've folded part of it inward. So you hold what is left with a pin so that we can join our sides together. So with the zip allowance free, you may not be able to take the right measurements because that will affect the length of the width of the back. So just use a pin to hold the zip allowance in as if you have attached a zip, or you can actually just sew a loose stitch. Sew a loose stitch down here to hold it in place. So now we have this. So this is the part where we take our measurements, our bust and our waist, so that we can sew our sides together. So you should hold the sides, raise the lining up because we want to do a knit finishing. So we'll be sewing the lining separately and the main fabric separately. So you're going to hold all your sides together so you don't have them shifting around. At the armhole here, hold them together. Okay, so now I want to join my sides. I'll lift up the lining and take my measurement. Okay, so here you need a chalk, a fabric chalk. So I have a blue one here. My bust circumference is 40. I will divide it by 4, which is 10, and I'll mark that on my bust. That's actually on the chest line here, not under it. So you mark it from the zip, take 10 inches to the edge of your armpit here. That's the end of your chest line, right? So now I'm marking 10 inches from here. So we have 10 here. What's actually left is my 1 inch sewing allowance that I added this part. So another way you could do this without taking measurement, you can just take in your allowance, but you may not always be right. So it's necessary for you to hold your fabric together and mark your reading. So I'm marking 10 inches here. So I'll come down on my waistline. I had 34 inches, which is, when you divide by 4, you get 8.5. So I have 8.5 here. So, sorry, mark it on your fabric, please, because we are going to raise the lining. So I've marked my allowance here. So I'll just go ahead and sew this. I'll sew this allowance, then I'll move on to sew the lining too by that same 1 inch. So I'm not sewing my lining with my main cloth. I'm going to sew 1 inch this way, then move upward till I get to the end of the lining. So I'm sewing them separately, but make sure the armhole, the edge of your armhole here align with each other, not that you're having fabric upward and the lining downward and all that. Your outfit won't look nice at all that way. So this is what we'll have on the outside. This is our armhole, and we'll have our neatly finished inner part. So I'll go ahead and take my measurement for this other side, for the other side of my top. So like I did when I was sewing this side, I've raised up my lining and make sure this side is also well pinned like we did for the first side. So now I'm going to take my tape and mark my measurements. So now I have a bust of 40 inches, bust circumference. So this time, because I'm going across, I'm not going to take 10 again. I need 20 now. That's divided by 2, right? So I'm just going to mark 20 inches from the top of my, the other edge. So as you can see, 20 inches here. So I'll just mark. And at the under bust, sorry, at the waistline, I'm going to mark 34 divided by 2, which is 17 inches. So I'm going to mark 17 inches here, and I'm going to sew by 17 by this allowance. Okay, so let's move on. So as you sew, make sure you're pulling out each pin. Don't leave your pin with your outfit. I'm turning this way so that I can sew my lining. So if this is going to confuse you, you can go ahead and mark the reading on your lining again. Or you can mark your lining when you mark your main cloth. Just make a mark on the lining as well. So this is what we have now. Neatly finished sides. See. And at this point, if you are not very sure of your measurements, you can go ahead to test fit it, especially if you are making it for yourself. So you may need to do that before fixing the lower part. But if all you have is the measurement, just take your tape and measure again to be sure you have taken the right measurement. And now we'll move on to treating our peplum, our flare rather, the lower part of our peplum top. So here we have 3 pieces. This is for the front, a full circle for the front, and 2 other half circle for the back. That's a full circle for the back, sliced into 2. Okay, so now the first thing we're going to do is to attach each of these to each side of the front. So I'm going to attach this to this and attach this to this other side, so that the joining will be at the sides. That's at the side of our dress, and we can have a zip allowance at the back. So this is the full circle for the front, and I'm attaching this. That's half of the circle for my back to each side of that of the front. I hope what I'm saying makes sense. So right side facing each other, I'm joining them together. I'm joining the back to each side of the front. One thing I forgot to mention when we're taking our flare was that you should add sewing allowance to your cycle, like an extra 1 inch for this joining, so that you have a perfect length to go around your waistline. So let's assume you have a waist of 30 inches. You divide 30 inches when you want to make a double circle flare. You divide 30 inches into 2, that's 15 inches. 15 inches, you add an extra 1 inch because you're going to be joining it to that of the back before dividing by 6.28. And then you take the back as well. The back, remember, you add zip allowance 2 inches, then you add 1 inch for the joining on the sides before dividing it by 6.28 to get your full circle flare. So I'll just do this on the other side so that I can have one open end at the back for my zip allowance. So this is our flare, our double flare, after joining the sides together. So as you can see, it already looks full, and so you need to work on the lining next. Do exactly what you did on this. Join the front to the back of the lining. Remember, we have a lining for each piece of the flare. So you're going to join the back lining to each side of the front to have something like this, because we will then lay it on this and sew our crinoline or horsehair braid on it. So now I'm just going to pin my lining on my clothes, and when I'm sewing, I sew my crinoline or horsehair braid on the wrong side of my fabric. Okay, but let's leave the horsehair braid now. So I'm going to pin my lining all through, just to make sure I don't have it dragging here and there. I don't want it disturbing me at all, hence this process. I'll make sure that this joining here at the side aligns with what I have on my main fabric, and I'll just spread it out. So I'll do this through all round. I'm going to pin my lining, so that way I'm securing it. Now I've secured my lining on my fabric, right side facing each other, and next I'll be sewing my horsehair braid. I'll place it on my main fabric and we'll sew by 1/2 inch throughout the hem of our flare by 1/2 inch with the horsehair braid on top of the main fabric and the lining at the back, well secured, please. So now I'm sewing by 1/2 inch throughout the entire length of my fabric. So now I'm going to remove all the pins I have in, because I want to turn my line the other way. So I have my lining this way, right side facing the right side of my fabric, and the crinoline on the on the wrong side of my fabric. So the next thing I'll be doing is to top stitch on my lining. So remove all the pins you have on this upper part so you can turn your lining. But before then, you need to notch all around your all around the curve of your flare here. So you may want to raise your horsehair apart because it misbehaves when cut. So and just cut the main fabric and the lining, tiny notches all through. Be sure not to cut through the sewing you just made. We are going to raise our lining, tilt our horsehair braid towards the lining and top stitch. So all we have here is the main fabric, and And here we have the horsehair braid, the allowance, and the lining. So you're going to top stitch by 1/4 or 1/8 of an inch on the lining side, just to keep things in place. Now we are done top stitching on our lining, and the next thing we'll be doing is to close the edges of our flare. So this is one edge, that's the part that goes to the zip allowance. This is what the top stitching looks like. So you're going to turn this just the way we turn the armhole. We're going to use this lining to turn. This is what you're going to do, turn it all around, then you sew by 1/2 an inch. So you do that on both sides of the flare. Let's do this. So now I'm going to turn my flare inside out and give it a good press before fixing to the upper part of my bodice, of my peplum top rather. Now I'm top stitching the upper edge of my flare, because I want to sew it on the upper part of my peplum without any issue, without the lining dragging the main fabric and all that. So when you do this, it just helps it stay in place and makes fixing it on the bodice easier. Here is our fully treated flare. Let's see what we have on the inside. And so we're going to attach this upper edge around our waistline, around the waistline of our peplum top. And this is what we're going to do. So we don't need here pinned in any longer. So we'll do this before attaching the zip. We're going to attach this peplum on the main fabric. So by attaching it only on the main fabric, lift up your lining. That's the lining of the upper bodice. We'll be using it to finish this waistline up so that we'll have a completely clean finishing. So now take your peplum, your flare, and from the zip allowance you're going to pin. When you get to this joining on your flare, make sure it aligns with the joining at the side of your upper bodice. Then you continue all the way around to the other side. If you're working on this and you happen to have an excess, don't worry, you can always make pleats, maybe along your dart, or you can just be creative and make it a form of design, maybe a kid's pleat or something. But if you have a deficit, then there's real trouble, because that means you didn't calculate your flare properly and you may have to recut or trim the edges of your flare so that you increase the width of the entire flare. But that will mean your peplum gown will look shorter than it was originally designed to look. Okay, so I have this well pinned on the fabric of the upper part of my peplum, and now I'm going to sew by 1/2 inch throughout all the length of my waistline, from one zip allowance to the other zip allowance. Okay, so I've fixed here by 1/2 inch. That's my waistline, and we're almost done. Now I need to turn this in using my lining, and here's what we'll do. So just the way we usually turn every other thing. So I'm turning here this way, and I'll be sewing 1/2 inch all the way down. So because you can't completely close here, we'll be leaving about 6 inches thereabouts, and we'll finish that part up with needle and thread. Okay, so I'm just going to be sewing 1/2 inch, gradually pulling my lining and closing this up. So midway I'll start again from this other part, turn it in and sew 1/2 inch. So when I get to the last 6 inches, I'll stop, use the needle and a thread to finish up my sewing. So when you're doing this, make sure your darts, the side joining, the side seams, they are aligned with what you have on the fabric. If at any point they don't, because you're working with the lining here, you can pleat like I'm doing here. So just create a tiny pleat to make up for the excess. Be sure you're not sewing more than 1/2 inch. You can actually sew less than 1/2 inch so that your seam will be inward. but then don't make your seam at this point more than ½ inch. Okay, I'm having a terrible lining day here. So if you want to avoid this, you can just use a satin. See, some of these linings, they misbehave a lot. So I'm starting from the other side now, the other side of my zip allowance. And I'll be sewing by ½ inch till I get close to the last part I sew on the other side. So once again, I'm making sure my darts aligns properly with the darts on my clothes. The darts on the lining and the darts on the clothes. Then the side seam. So I have this is the inner part of my top. This is the lining of the upper bodice. This is the flare part. So now I have the last about 7 inches here to sew in. So this is what I'm going to do. I'll fold in my allowance. Okay, so we're going to finish this up using a needle and thread. I've tied the end of my thread here. So I'm going to take a little bit from here. First I'll start it up by sewing from inside out so that the tied part will be inside. So now I'm going to take a little bit from each side this way. You don't have to make it tight, just gradually pull your thread. Okay, so here. So I have my allowance folded inside. This is the allowance for the upper part of my peplum top. So I'm going to take a little bit from here. Pull my thread out. Then I'll take the next one from the flare. Pull out, so that way you're gradually closing up this opened area. So you go back, take from the lining of the upper bodice, take a little bit from the flare. So this is what you're going to do till you get to the end, till you completely close this part up. Okay, so now we're almost done with this part, and you see how neat it appears here. And you just So I'm just going to finish it up here. Take a tiny bit from this side and then tie. Just the way you tighten any seam. Tighten properly so that it doesn't come off. And you cut out. So that's it. We have a properly finished look on the inside, and now we'll be moving to the last thing, which is the fixing of the zip. We're going to fix our zip on the zip allowance here. We are going to have an open end zip in this case. So you may first need to pin here down. That's up to you if it's going to make it easier for you. So make sure the waistline aligns with each other, and then that's why it may be necessary for you to pin, and the top aligns with each other as well, so you don't have to start losing once you're done sewing. Okay. I'm starting from the base here. Make sure you have the same allowance you have here on this other side. So at the base here, we're going to sew this part in just to keep it in place. You may sew like ½ inch or even 1 inch. So I'll do the same thing on the other side. And at the top, because I've used a longer zip than necessary, I'm going to zip down and trim my zip. But make sure your zip is down, then I'll trim this edge and leave about 1 inch at the top. Recall that my yoke wasn't part of my zip allowance, so I'll just easily turn this in, then top stitch on this part. So I'll do the same thing on both sides. So we are here now. This is the best part of it, where you get to see what you have made looking good on yourself or on your client. So here is all the hard work. So if you have watched this far, thank you very much for watching. It's time for you to go make yours and put up a picture of yourself wearing it, and let's assess it together. So see you in the next class.